Sophie took Eliana home while Mikey and Sky scrubbed potatoes under the kitchen tap, and Hannah stayed up the gully helping Joe with Shadrach. At one stage, Joe sent Hannah back to the house for the box of veterinary supplies, and Mikey saw that Hannah was crying. Tears like snail tracks dried on her cheeks and more spilled out of her eyes. He wanted to tell her that Shadrach would be okay. He wanted to do one of his silly walks that would make her laugh. But his own throat thickened up, his eyes stung, and words got stuck. He couldn't even hug her because his hands were wet from the sink. Sky stared at her. "Why is Hannah crying?" "I don't cry when Shadrach gets deaded." "Shadrach isn't getting deaded," said Mikey. "Finish that potato." "No, fat cat!" He looked down at the cat rubbing against his ankle. Cats don't like potatoes. "It is finished. Can we have a proper funeral?" "I can see some dirt in it." "That's not dirt, that's a hole. Shadrach could have a ginormous coffin. Bigger than great-grandpa's, eh? Big as the boat, I reckon. If it's a hole, cut it out. Holes don't get in potatoes by themselves. You want to eat boiled potato worm?" Sky dropped the potato quickly and wiped his hands on his shirt. "I'm going to see Shadrach." When Mikey had finished the potatoes, he washed a lettuce for salad. He was very interested in cooking. Last year, when he was 8, he won a $1 prize at the local show for his shortbread, and Miss McNichol, the judge, said his shortbread was so good that she brought the tray from him for an extra $2. He read recipe books, finding exciting things to cook like chocolate orange gateau and black forest cherry cake and bomb Alaska. But Sophie said cooking was like everything else. You had to start with the basics. Basic was a word for boring stuff like porridge, gravy, stew, custard. There were other restrictions as well. Since the time he'd set fire to the curtains, Mikey wasn't allowed to use the stove when Sophie or Joe weren't there. Sometimes, though, they let him cook the whole dinner, pudding as well, and that meant he could sit back afterwards while the others washed the dishes. Hannah and Sky moaned about all the pots and bowls he used. He tore up the lettuce, drained it, and put it in a bowl with sliced tomatoes and cucumbers, spring onions, and a lot of grated cheese on top. Mikey liked cheese. So did Fat Cat, who yowled beside him. He heard the car return, but Sophie didn't come into the house. He guessed that she had gone straight up the gully to join the others with Shadrach. Mikey put the salad on the table and ran outside. The sun was down behind the hills and the whole bay was in cool shadow. There was sunlight on the other side of the sound, but the hills there too were creased with dark shade. The sky had the distant look of approaching night. Shadrach was still lying on his side, but his head was up and he was watching Joe, Sophie, Sky and Hannah, who was sitting on the grass near him. Hannah looked pale, but she was no longer crying. "Is his leg broken?" Mikey asked. "No," said Joe. "No broken bones. It's not as bad as we first thought. We think he's just strained a ligament. We'll put a cover on him, give him some hay, and he'll probably be up in the morning." "I helped Joe give him a injection in the bum," Sky said. "He's had a shot to help the shock and give him a bit of energy," said Joe. "He's going to be okay. The main problem with him is age, and that's not something we can cure. He's definitely too old for tricks. I thought we all would have known that." There was silence, and Mikey wanted to protest. He would never have made Shadrach bow down. But this was Joe's way of talking to include everyone, sharing the blame round the family rather than putting it on one person. At times it seemed unfair. Sophie said, "Poor old Shadrach. The arthritis in his joints has got worse. I don't think he's going to manage another winter on this place." "You said that last year," muttered Hannah. "He was all right." "He wasn't all right," Joe said. "He was in a great deal of pain, and I think it's high time we made a decision about his future." "He'll be fine," cried Hannah. "He'll live for years yet." Mikey observed the panic in her face, and he sat down in the grass beside her. They all loved Shadrach, but love had lots of shapes and sizes, and while Mikey's love somehow fitted in with cooking, playing chess, and his new fishing rod, For Hannah, it was a people kind of love. She loved Shadrach as much as the rest of the family. Mikey had always known that. Joe and Sophie looked at each other. They were holding hands. In front of them, Shadrach kept turning his head every now and then to be part of the conversation. He'd twitch his ears and curl his oversized hairy lips as though he had human words in his mouth and was trying to get them out. He was really old, Mikey thought. His eyes had gone like great-grandpa's had been. They were sunk deep, with the whites turned red and the irises covered with a milky blue film. Joe said, "Shadrach shouldn't be here. The hills are steep. It's cold in winter. Sophie and I have been talking about it for some time, and, well, we feel he'll have to go somewhere else," said Sophie. "Where?" asked Hannah. "Hey," said Mikey, "we could take him round to Waitaria Bay. We'll ask Mr. and Mrs. Gerritsen if he can go in the school horse paddock. That's not steep." "That's it!" cried Hannah. "Shadrach knows the school paddock, and he wouldn't be lonely because we'd see him nearly every single day." "That's not what we had in mind, Hannah," said Sophie, reaching past Sky to stroke her daughter's hair. "It'd be nice for you, but what about Shadrach? It's cold in Waitaria Bay too. There'd be no shelter for him at night." "We'll build him a stable," said Hannah. "No. Shadrach is going to Nelson," said Joe. "Nelson?" said Hannah. "It's the practical thing to do," Joe said. "Why Nelson?" Joe held his hands towards her. "Look, what do you think happens to horses when they have to be retired?" "I know," said Mikey. "They go out to graze and clover." Joe said, "Mikey, we don't have the means." "Yes, you're right, Mikey," said Sophie, suddenly leaning forward. "Old horses are put into a beautiful paddock of red clover, and at night there are warm stables with oats and hay. They go to a rest home for aged equestrian friends." "Is that what it's called?" said Hannah. Sophie glanced at Joe. "Something like that. The stables are centrally heated in winter and the horses get groomed every day. They have lots of people to love them." "All right, Sophie," said Joe. "I don't think—" Sophie put her hand on his arm and then said to Hannah, "You know we'd do absolutely the best thing for Shadrach." "Won't it cost an awful lot?" said Hannah. "You said we couldn't afford any extra." "It won't cost a thing," Sophie said. "How do we get him there?" "Listen," said Joe. "A few days ago I had a phone call from Neil Stack. He's going from Christchurch to Nelson with a horse float, and he wondered if I could meet him at Havelock with a couple of sacks of mussels. I've been thinking that he might be persuaded to make a detour and pick up Shadrach as well." "Who's Neil Stack?" asked Mikey. "I remember him," said Hannah. "He works at some stables and he really likes horses." "He's crazy about them," Joe said. "You can be sure he'd see that Shadrach had a comfortable journey." "Will his leg be better by then?" asked Hannah. "He's almost ready to get on his feet now," said Joe. "But what I'd do is make a sling for him and fit it in the horse float to ease some of the weight off his legs." He stood up. "Who's going to help me get some hay for him?" "I will," said Sophie. "Hannah, Mikey, Sky, you go in and set the table. And Hannah, I do like your new friend Lana. She's lovely." Hannah waited until her parents had moved beyond sound and then said, "Her name's not Lana and she's not lovely. She's a murderess." "Who did she murder?" asked Sky, immediately interested. "She kills magic," said Hannah severely. "What magic?" "Say apricot." "Apricot," said Sky. Hannah turned to Mikey. He shrugged, put his hands in his pockets and mumbled, "Apricot." Hannah held her hands up as though she were catching air. "Apricot," she announced. Then she folded her arms, leaned forward and whispered, "She spoke in the presence of H.M." "Hannibal Megasaurus!" shrieked Sky, jumping up and down and holding onto the seat of his pants. Hannah said in her storytelling voice, "With no regard for the sacred place, she criticised the powerful and splendorous H.M., who holds life and death in the palm of her hand." "Palm of her hoof," corrected Sky. Hannah crossed her fingers. She actually sneered at Hannibal Megasaurus, and she said foxgloves were poisonous weeds. She's a barbarian. Did a calamity happen to her? Skye asked eagerly. No, but it will. Skye began to chant. Her food will taste like dirt. Her food will taste like dirt. Mud, said Hannah, for a whole week. Mikey looked round them at the thick shadows brooding under the trees. Come on, Hannah, we made all that up. Of course we did, said Hannah, still in her storytelling voice. God made up the world. Joe and Sophie made us up. When you make up something, it becomes real. It starts to live on its own, and there's no way you can unmake it again. I thought Anna was okay, said Mikey. She liked my posters. She's got really big eyes, said Skye. Her name's not Anna or Lana, said Hannah. It's Eliana, and she spelled it for them. Eliana, repeated Mikey. That's not a very high-scoring Scrabble word, if you could use it. Hannah stared at him, then laughed. No, it isn't. Not as good as Hannah and Mikey and Skye. One by one, they kissed Shadrach on the nose and said goodnight to him. They walked back to the house, Hannah going ahead of Mikey and Skye. What's a barbarian? Asked Skye. I don't know, Mikey said. I think it's a woman who does haircuts, said Skye. He stopped. Does she cut people's hair? Don't think so, said Mikey. You better ask Hannah. They caught up with Hannah and walked together down the path to the back door, entering the kitchen just in time to see Fat Cat eating the cheese from the top of the salad.